April 30th, 1943. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The morning sun cut through the hangar doors at the Army Air Force's Flight Test Engineering branch, illuminating two aircraft that looked nearly identical from the outside, but represented entirely different futures for the war in Europe. Lieutenant Robert Chilton stood between them, his hand resting on the cowling of the aircraft to his right, feeling the residual warmth from the test flight he'd just completed. In his left hand, crumpled from repeated reading, sat a performance report that contained numbers so extraordinary they seemed like typographical errors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The aircraft on his left, a standard P-51, a Mustang powered by its original Allison engine, had just clocked 382 miles per hour at 13,000 feet. Respectable, useful for ground attack and reconnaissance. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison-powered Mustang became sluggish, starved for oxygen, outmatched by every German fighter protecting the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The aircraft on his right, identical in every way except for the engine beating beneath its cowling, had just reached 441 miles per hour at 29,000 feet, nearly 100 miles per hour faster at altitudes where the air war would be won or lost. What Lieutenant Chilton didn't know, what nobody at Wright Field that morning could have fully grasped, was that the aircraft beside him represented more than an engineering improvement. Within months, this single modification would crack open the fortress Europe had built around its war machine. The heavily defended factories, the carefully protected fuel refineries, the cities that had seemed untouchable beyond the range of Allied fighters, all of them were about to become accessible, not through new tactics or additional air bases, but through 27 cubic inches of additional engine displacement and a supercharger design that British engineers had been perfecting while German bombs fell on London. The crisis that brought these two aircraft to stand side by side in an Ohio hangar had been building since August 17, 1942, when 230 B-17 Flying Fortresses struck the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in German-occupied France. That raid, the first American heavy bomber mission over Europe, returned with minimal losses. The Luftwaffe had been caught off guard. The Americans celebrated. The celebrations were premature. By October 19, 1942, when 108 B-17s attacked the Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt, German fighter defenses had awakened. The bomber formations encountered coordinated attacks by Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. 40 American airmen died. The lesson became brutally clear. Daylight precision bombing, the entire strategic doctrine upon which American air power doctrine rested, would be impossible without fighter escorts capable of accompanying the bombers deep into enemy territory. The problem was simple to state and appeared impossible to solve. The B-17 had a combat radius of approximately 800 miles when fully loaded with bombs and fuel. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the most capable American fighter available in early 1943, could escort bombers approximately 475 miles from English bases with external fuel tanks. This left a gap of more than 300 miles, where American bombers flew unprotected through the most heavily defended airspace in human history. Every mile deeper into Germany, the casualties mounted, 8% losses on some missions, 10% on others, occasionally higher. At such rates, bomber crews had less than a 25% chance of completing their required 25 missions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of the crisis were straightforward. The 8th Air Force needed a fighter that could fly from bases in England, escort bombers to targets in Berlin or beyond, engage in combat at altitudes above 25,000 feet, and return home with fuel reserves. In early 1943, no such aircraft existed in the American arsenal. The P-38 Lightning had the range but struggled at high altitude and cold temperatures. The P-47 Thunderbolt excelled in combat but lacked range. The P-51 Mustang had exceptional aerodynamics, but its Allison engine gasped for air above 15,000 feet. The North American P-51 had entered production under circumstances that were themselves remarkable. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, requesting that the company manufacture Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license to help supply the Royal Air Force. North American's president, James Kindleberger, made a counteroffer that bordered on arrogance. Instead of building someone else's design, he proposed designing and manufacturing a completely new fighter aircraft from scratch, and he promised to do it faster than North American could retool its factories for P-40 production. The British, desperate for aircraft as the Battle of Britain approached, agreed with conditions. The design must be completed within 120 days. Cost per aircraft could not exceed $40,000. Armament must match British specifications, and 2 aircraft from the production run would be delivered to the United States Army Air Corps at no charge for evaluation. On May 4, 1940, the contract was signed. What followed was a masterclass in focused engineering. Lead designer Edgar Schmude assembled a team that included Raymond Rice and Edgar Laborde. They worked 7 days a week, often 16 hours a day. The design philosophy was revolutionary for American aviation. Rather than optimize every component for maximum performance, they designed for production, efficiency, and aerodynamic cleanliness. The fuselage was divided into 5 major sections that could be manufactured separately, fitted with wiring and plumbing, then joined on the assembly line. The laminar flow wing, designed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, positioned maximum thickness well aft from the leading edge. This reduced drag by maintaining smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the wing surface. The cooling system represented perhaps the most elegant solution. Traditional liquid-cooled fighters mounted radiators in the nose, creating substantial drag. Schmude positioned the radiator assembly beneath the fuselage aft of the cockpit. Incoming air cooled the liquid, then exited through a controllable flap at increased velocity. Under specific conditions, this arrangement produced a slight net thrust, partially offsetting the drag created by the radiator scoop. Engineers called it the Meredith effect. Pilots called it ingenious. On September 9, 1940, 102 days after contract signing, the NA-73X prototype rolled out of the factory in Inglewood, California. It had no engine. Allison V-1710 engines were in short supply, and the allocated engine hadn't arrived. The aircraft sat on borrowed wheels from a training aircraft, but the airframe was complete. On October 26, 1940, with an Allison engine finally installed, test pilot Vance Breeze took the prototype on its maiden flight. The aircraft handled beautifully. Speed, agility, and control response exceeded expectations. The Royal Air Force designated the production aircraft Mustang Mark I. The United States Army Air Corps, which had initially shown little interest, reluctantly accepted 2 evaluation aircraft designated XP-51. Testing at Wright Field in October 1941 produced enthusiastic reports. At low and medium altitudes, the Mustang outperformed every American fighter in service. Range was exceptional. The internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons, combined with the efficient aerodynamics, gave the Mustang a combat radius exceeding 700 miles. But there was a ceiling to this excellence. Above 15,000 feet, performance degraded noticeably. The Allison V-1710 engine used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger optimized for low-altitude performance. As ambient air pressure decreased with altitude, the supercharger couldn't compress sufficient air into the cylinders to maintain power output. At 20,000 feet, the Mustang was merely adequate. At 25,000 feet, where B-17s typically flew and where German fighters attacked, the Allison-powered Mustang was outmatched. The Royal Air Force deployed their Mustangs in the tactical reconnaissance role, where low-altitude performance mattered most. The aircraft excelled, fast enough to evade interceptors, agile enough for evasive maneuvers, equipped with cameras and light armament. On July 27, 1942, Mustangs flew their first combat mission, photographing German positions in France. The missions were successful, but reconnaissance was not going to win the air war over Germany. Ronald Harker understood engines the way concert pianists understand keyboards. As Rolls-Royce's chief test pilot, he had logged more hours in Merlin-powered aircraft than perhaps anyone alive. The Merlin engine powered the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, the Avro Lancaster bomber. It was the engineering foundation of Britain's air defences and bomber offensive. When Harker flew a captured Mustang at the Royal Aircraft Establishment on April 30th, 1942, he immediately recognised both the aircraft's brilliance and its limitation. The Mustang's airframe was superior to the Spitfire in several respects: lower drag, better range, more internal fuel capacity. But the Allison engine strangled that potential at higher altitudes. Harker wrote in his report that the Mustang's performance could be vastly improved by installing a Merlin 61 engine with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. The suggestion was radical. The Merlin was a British engine, manufactured under license in the United States by Packard Motor Company for installation in American-built British aircraft, but it had never been installed in an aircraft designed around a different engine. The Merlin 61 represented years of development driven by combat necessity. The first stage of the two-stage supercharger compressed incoming air. An intercooler reduced the temperature of that compressed air. The second stage compressed it again. This double compression allowed the engine to produce sea-level horsepower up to altitudes approaching 30,000 feet. The engineering was complex. The manufacturing was expensive, but in air combat at 25,000 feet, the two-stage Merlin provided decisive advantages. In October 1942, Rolls-Royce fitted 4 RAF Mustangs with Merlin 65 engines. The modifications required extensive changes. The Merlin was over 350 pounds heavier than the Allison. The propeller shaft centerline was higher. The cooling requirements differed. Engineers moved the wing mounting points forward to maintain proper center of gravity. They enlarged the air intake scoop under the fuselage. They redesigned engine mounts and cowling panels. On October 13, 1942, test pilot Ronald Harker flew the first Merlin-powered Mustang, designated Mustang X. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. At 25,000 feet, the aircraft that had struggled to maintain 390 miles per hour with the Allison engine now reached 422 miles per hour. Climb rate increased substantially. Service ceiling extended beyond 40,000 feet. The fighter that had been relegated to low-altitude reconnaissance suddenly became a high-altitude interceptor. Word of the British tests reached the United States through multiple channels. Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American air attaché in London, sent detailed reports to Washington. Hitchcock, a decorated World War I pilot and accomplished polo player, understood both aviation and how to navigate military bureaucracy. His reports emphasized that the Merlin-powered Mustang could solve the escort fighter crisis. The bombers needed protection at 25,000 feet over Germany. The Merlin Mustang could provide it. North American aviation moved quickly. In June 1942, before official authorization, the company began designing modifications to install Packard-built Merlin engines in the Mustang airframe. The changes were substantial. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger required additional ducting. The intercooler needed integration into the cooling system. The four-bladed propeller required different engine mounts, but North American's engineers had designed the original airframe in 102 days. They understood rapid development. In August 1942, 3 months before the first American-built prototype would fly, the Army Air Forces placed an order for 400 Merlin-powered Mustangs designated P-51B. The Air Forces were betting the future of their bombing campaign on an aircraft that existed only as engineering drawings and British test reports. It was a calculated risk driven by desperate necessity. The bomber losses over Germany were unsustainable. The escort fighter gap had to be closed. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On November 30th, 1942, North American test pilot Bob Chilton flew the first P-51B from the factory airfield in Inglewood. The Packard V1653 Merlin engine produced 1,500 horsepower at 3,000 RPM. The four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller efficiently converted that power into thrust. Chilton climbed to altitude and advanced the throttle. The results matched, then exceeded, the British tests. At 29,000 feet, the P-51B reached 441 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison-powered version at the same altitude. The performance figures were transformative. Combat radius with internal fuel approached 450 miles. With two 75-gallon external drop tanks, radius extended beyond 850 miles. With careful fuel management and the addition of an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot, the P-51B could escort bombers to Berlin and return to England. The escort fighter gap could be closed not through new bases or aerial refueling or sacrificing bomb loads, but through installing a better engine in an already exceptional airframe. Production of the P-51B began at North American's Inglewood plant in June 1943. The first operational aircraft reached England in November 1943, delivered to the 354th Fighter Group stationed at Boxted. The Mustangs arrived painted in olive drab and grey, their long noses housing Packard Merlins that gave them capabilities no American fighter had previously possessed. The ground crews were skeptical. Another new fighter type meant more training, more spare parts, complications, more maintenance procedures to learn. The pilots were curious. The performance specifications suggested this aircraft might actually reach the targets where bomber crews were dying. The first combat mission for the P-51B Mustangs came on December 1, 1943. 42 Mustangs from the 354th Fighter Group escorted B-17 bombers attacking the port facilities at Solingen, Germany. The mission profile represented exactly what the 8th Air Force needed. The bombers penetrated deep into German airspace. The Mustangs stayed with them throughout the entire mission. German fighters that had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted bomber formations suddenly found themselves facing American fighters at altitudes where the Luftwaffe had previously operated with impunity. The Mustang pilots discovered their aircraft possessed advantages beyond just range and altitude performance. The laminar flow wing design gave exceptional maneuverability at high speeds. The visibility from the cockpit, while not perfect with the Razorback canopy design, was adequate for spotting enemy fighters. The 650 caliber machine guns, 4 in the wings and 2 in the fuselage, provided concentrated firepower. And perhaps most importantly, the Mustang could outdive and out-accelerate nearly every German fighter it encountered. When Bf-109 or VFW-190 pilots attempted to dive away from combat, the Mustang could follow and press the attack. The psychological impact on bomber crews was immediate and profound. For months, they had flown missions knowing that partway to the target, the fighter escort would turn back due to fuel limitations. The drone of bomber engines would continue alone through increasingly hostile skies. German fighters would appear as distant specks, then closer, then directly ahead or above or below, attacking in coordinated waves. Gunners would fire at targets moving at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Aircraft would shudder from impacts. Engines would flame. Wings would fold. Men would die or bail out over enemy territory. And through it all, the formation would continue toward the target, because turning back meant the mission failed and the losses were for nothing. The arrival of Mustangs that could accompany bombers throughout the entire mission fundamentally changed the bomber crew's combat experience. The fighter pilots called their charges the big friends. The bomber crews called the fighters their little friends. The terminology suggested affection, but the emotion was deeper than that. The Mustang pilots represented survival. Their presence meant German fighters had to fight through the escort before reaching the bombers. Every German fighter engaged by a Mustang was one less fighter attacking the formation. Every German pilot forced to break off was one less threat. The mathematics of survival shifted in the bombers' favor. Major James Howard, of the 354th Fighter Group, demonstrated what a single determined Mustang pilot could accomplish on January 11, 1944. Howard was escorting B-17s attacking industrial targets at Oschersleben when his flight encountered a formation of approximately 30 German fighters preparing to attack the bombers. Howard's flight scattered during the initial engagement. Howard found himself alone, facing multiple German fighters with bombers under attack behind him. For more than 30 minutes, Howard engaged the German fighters single-handedly. He dove into their formations, disrupted their attack patterns, shot down multiple aircraft, and continued engaging new threats as they appeared. His fuel exhausted, ammunition spent, aircraft damaged, Howard returned to England. The bomber crews reported that a single P-51 had prevented what could have been a massacre. Howard received the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the award. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation of the air war accelerated through early 1944. Production of the P-51B ramped up at Inglewood, while a second production line opened at North American's Dallas plant, producing the virtually identical P-51C. By February 1944, multiple fighter groups had transitioned to Mustangs. The 8th Air Force possessed sufficient numbers to implement new tactics. Fighter sweeps would precede bomber formations, engaging German fighters before they could organize coordinated attacks. Other Mustang formations would escort the bombers directly. Additional flights would patrol known German fighter bases, attacking aircraft during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. February 20th through 25th, 1944, marked a turning point designated Operation Argument, more commonly known as Big Week. The 8th Air Force, joined by the 15th Air Force operating from Italy, launched coordinated attacks against German aircraft production facilities. The strategic goal was straightforward: destroy the factories producing Bf-109s, FW-190s, and Me-210s before they could replace the fighters being lost in combat. Over 6 days, American bombers flew nearly 4,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe rose to defend their aircraft factories, throwing hundreds of fighters into massive aerial battles. Mustang pilots destroyed approximately 200 German fighters in air-to-air combat during Big Week. German pilot losses were even more significant than aircraft losses. Experienced fighter pilots, the instructors and formation leaders who represented years of training and combat knowledge, died defending factories that produced more fighters but couldn't produce more experienced pilots. The German response evolved throughout spring 1944. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, recognized that standard fighter tactics were no longer effective against escorted bomber formations. German fighters needed concentrated firepower to destroy the heavily armored B-17s and B-24s. Individual fighters attacking from astern rarely inflicted fatal damage before the bombers' defensive fire drove them away. The solution was the Gefechtsverband, a battle formation consisting of heavily armed and armored foe 190A attack fighters escorted by Bf-109 fighters, whose sole mission was to prevent American fighters from interfering with the attack. The Gefechtsverband formations carried heavy armament. Some FOW-190s mounted 30mm cannons in wing pods, weapons powerful enough to destroy a bomber with a few hits. Additional armor protected the pilot and critical systems. The theory was sound. Concentrate overwhelming firepower, accept reduced maneuverability, rely on escort fighters to handle the American escorts, and destroy bombers at a rate that made the daylight bombing campaign unsustainable. In practice, the Gefechtsverband formations were difficult to assemble, slow to maneuver, and vulnerable to aggressive American fighter pilots who refused to be held away from the attack aircraft. Mustang pilots developed tactics specifically designed to break up these formations. Fighter sweeps would locate the German formations while they were still assembling. Attacks during the assembly phase disrupted coordination and often forced German fighters to jettison their external fuel tanks before reaching the bombers. If the German formation successfully reached the bombers, Mustang pilots would accept combat with the escort fighters while other flights attacked the heavily armed attack fighters. The WW-190s, laden with extra guns and armor, couldn't dogfight. Once engaged by Mustangs, they had to break off the attack or accept destruction. The impact on German bomber attrition rates was dramatic and quantifiable. In October 1943, before Mustangs arrived in significant numbers, the 8th Air Force lost 9% of dispatched bombers on missions deep into Germany. By April 1944, with Mustangs providing escort throughout the mission, loss rates dropped below 4%. The difference seems modest until calculated across hundreds of missions and thousands of sorties. The reduced losses meant more experienced crews surviving their tour of duty, more aircraft available for subsequent missions, less replacement training required. The cumulative advantages compounded month after month. The P-51D variant, introduced in spring 1944, addressed the Mustang's remaining significant weakness. The Razorback canopy design, inherited from the original Allison-powered version, restricted rearward visibility. German fighters attacking from the rear 6 o'clock position could approach close before pilots spotted them. North American's solution borrowed from British innovations on the Spitfire and Typhoon. Engineers cut down the fuselage structure behind the cockpit and installed a teardrop bubble canopy that provided 360-degree visibility. The first P-51D flew in November 1943. Production began at Inglewood in March 1944. The bubble canopy transformed pilot situational awareness, checking 6 o'clock no longer required craning around a headrest and fuselage structure. The pilot could simply look back and see any aircraft approaching from behind. In air combat, where seeing the enemy first often determined survival, the bubble canopy provided decisive advantages. The P-51D became the most produced Mustang variant. Between March 1944 and November 1945, North American built over 8,000 P-51D models at both the Inglewood and Dallas plants. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group demonstrated the Mustang's capabilities against Germany's most advanced operational fighter on October 7, 1944. Drew was flying top cover for bombers near Osnabrück when he spotted 2 Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters below him. The Me-262 represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. Twin jet engines produced thrust that no piston engine could match. Maximum speed exceeded 540 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. The 430mm cannons could shred a bomber with a single pass. If Germany had deployed Me-262s in large numbers earlier in the war, the daylight bombing campaign might have become impossible. Drew recognized the jets' vulnerability. Their speed advantage only existed during high-speed flight. During takeoff, landing, or when throttled back to conserve fuel, the Me-262s were vulnerable. Drew dove on the 2 jets, closing rapidly before the German pilots could accelerate to escape velocity. He destroyed one Me-262 with a burst of .50 caliber fire, then pursued the second jet as it attempted to dive away. The jet pilot, unable to out-accelerate the diving Mustang, was shot down moments later. Drew became the first American pilot to destroy 2 jet aircraft in a single mission. The campaign against the Luftwaffe extended beyond aerial combat. Beginning in April 1944, Mustang pilots received authorization to strafe German airfields during return flights from escort missions. The tactic was dangerous. German airfields were heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns. Flying low and slow to engage parked aircraft exposed the Mustangs to concentrated ground fire, but the results justified the risks. Hundreds of German fighters were destroyed on the ground, never reaching combat altitude. Fuel storage facilities were set ablaze. Repair hangars were strafed. The attacks forced the Luftwaffe to disperse aircraft away from major bases, complicating maintenance and reducing operational readiness. By June 6, 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the battle for air superiority over Western Europe. The German Air Force that had terrorized Europe in 1940 and 1941, that had nearly defeated the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, now struggled to mount effective resistance against overwhelming Allied air power. On D-Day itself, the the Luftwaffe flew fewer than 100 sorties over the invasion beaches. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties. German ground forces fought without effective air support, while Allied fighter bombers attacked with near impunity. The contribution of the Merlin-powered Mustang to this transformation cannot be overstated. Before the P-51B entered service in December 1943, American daylight bombing missions deep into Germany suffered unsustainable casualties. After Mustangs provided long-range escort, loss rates dropped by more than half. German fighter production couldn't replace losses. German pilot training couldn't replace experienced pilots. The industrial capacity and infrastructure that sustained Germany's war effort became vulnerable to systematic destruction. Oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, transportation networks, all became targets that American bombers could reach and destroy with acceptable losses. The engineering transformation that made this possible was remarkably straightforward in concept. Take an aircraft with excellent aerodynamics, good handling, and long range. Replace the engine with one that maintains power output at high altitude. The execution required sophisticated engineering, rapid manufacturing ramp-up, and pilots willing to fly the new aircraft deep into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. But the fundamental breakthrough was recognizing that the Mustang's limitation wasn't the airframe design, it was the engine. And engines could be changed. North American aviation ultimately produced 15,575 Mustangs of all variants between 1940 and 1946. The Inglewood plant alone reached peak production of 16 aircraft per day in 1944. The Dallas plant produced another 4,881 aircraft. Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation in Australia assembled an additional 200 under license. The production rates, while impressive, paled compared to the truly mass-produced fighters like the FO 190 or the Yak-9. But Mustangs didn't need to outnumber their opponents. They needed to outperform them at the altitudes and ranges where the war would be decided. The Merlin engine modification accomplished exactly that. The strategic impact extended beyond the immediate tactical advantages. The ability to escort bombers throughout their missions meant that no German industrial target was safe. The Luftwaffe had to defend everywhere, spreading already inadequate fighter forces across multiple threatened areas. German fighters consumed fuel that could have powered tanks or trucks. German factories produced fighters instead of artillery or ammunition. German pilots died defending synthetic fuel plants that the bombers eventually destroyed anyway, eliminating the fuel that would have allowed the Luftwaffe to continue operating. The Mustang didn't win the war alone, but it made the Allied strategic bombing campaign viable, and that campaign systematically dismantled Germany's capacity to wage war. After Victory in Europe Day in May 1945, Mustangs shifted to the Pacific Theater. The strategic situation there paralleled Europe. Boeing B-29 superfortresses needed fighter escorts for missions over Japan. The distances were even greater. From bases in Iwo Jima to Tokyo was over 650 nautical miles. From Iwo Jima to Osaka or Nagoya exceeded 700 nautical miles. Only the Mustang possessed sufficient range to escort the bombers throughout these missions. The 7th Air Force and the newly formed 20th Air Force equipped fighter groups with P-51Ds specifically for bomber escort duty over Japan. The first Mustang escort mission over the Japanese home islands occurred on April 7, 1945. 108 P-51Ds from Iwo Jima escorted B-29s attacking aircraft factories near Tokyo. Japanese fighters rose to intercept. The Mustang pilots discovered that Ki-43 Hayabusa and Ki-44 Shoki fighters, formidable opponents for earlier American fighters, were outmatched by the P-51D. Speed, climb rate, firepower, all favored the Mustang. Japanese losses mounted. American bombers completed their missions with reduced casualties. The pattern established over Germany repeated over Japan. The war ended in August 1945, before Mustangs could demonstrate their full impact in the Pacific, but the principle had been proven. Long-range strategic bombing required long-range fighter escorts. The Merlin-powered Mustang provided that capability. Every other consideration, the politics of inter-service rivalry, the competing demands for production capacity, the resistance from officers committed to other fighter types, all became secondary to the operational necessity of protecting bomber crews and ensuring mission success. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, brought the Mustang back to combat in a different role. Redesignated 51, to reflect the newly independent United States Air Force nomenclature, Mustangs flew ground attack and close air support missions. The aircraft that had been designed for high-altitude escort work found itself attacking tanks, supply convoys, and artillery positions at treetop level. The mission was dangerous. The liquid-cooled engine, so efficient at altitude, became a vulnerability during low-level operations. A single bullet through the cooling system meant the engine would overheat and fail. Mustang pilots in Korea suffered higher loss rates than their World War II counterparts, not because the 51 was obsolete, but because close air support missions exposed aircraft to concentrated ground fire. Jets eventually replaced the 51 in frontline service. The North American F-86 Sabre, powered by a turbojet engine and capable of exceeding the speed of sound in a dive, represented the next generation of fighter design. The Mustang remained in Air National Guard and Reserve units through 1957, providing a trained pool of pilots and maintainers familiar with high-performance fighters. The last Mustangs in American military service flew as chase aircraft for experimental programs at Edwards Air Force Base in California through 1968, nearly 3 decades after the prototype first flew. The transformation from wartime necessity to peacetime legacy began before the final shots were fired. In hangars across England and the Pacific, mechanics who had maintained Mustangs through thousands of combat hours recognized something unusual about the aircraft. Unlike many wartime designs optimized exclusively for military performance, the P-51 possessed characteristics that translated well to civilian use. The airframe was robust but not excessively heavy. The Merlin engine, while complex, was well documented and supported by an extensive parts supply chain. The handling characteristics were forgiving enough for competent pilots, yet responsive enough for advanced maneuvers. These qualities, designed to keep combat pilots alive, would make the Mustang one of the most successful warbirds in aviation history. The immediate post-war years saw thousands of Mustangs declared surplus. The Army Air Forces, transitioning to the United States Air Force in September 1947, needed to reduce inventory rapidly. Jet fighters represented the future. Piston-engine fighters, regardless of their wartime success, became excess inventory. The government sold Mustangs to allied nations, to reserve units, and eventually to civilian buyers. Purchase prices that seem absurd in retrospect reflected the glut of surplus military aircraft. In 1946, a civilian could purchase a combat veteran P-51D for $1,500, roughly 3% of its original production cost. The first civilian Mustang owners were often former military pilots who understood the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. They purchased Mustangs for personal transportation, for agricultural work, and increasingly for air racing. The national air races, dormant during the war, resumed in Cleveland in 1946. Wartime fighters dominated the unlimited class racing. Mustangs competed against Corsairs, Bearcats, and other high-performance fighters. The races drew enormous crowds. The speeds were unprecedented for civilian aviation. But the infrastructure was inadequate, and the safety margins were thin. In 1949, a pilot error led to a crash that killed 2 spectators and the pilot. The resulting investigations, combined with the outbreak of the Korean War, led to cancellation of the national air races after 1949. Air racing resumed in different form during the 1960s, centered on Reno, Nevada. The Reno Air Races, established in 1964, created a venue specifically designed for high-speed competition. Mustangs became dominant in the unlimited class. The combination of speed, reliability, and available parts made them ideal racing platforms. Owners invested substantial resources in modifications. Engines were rebuilt to higher power outputs, Propellers were optimized for racing speeds rather than combat profiles. Wings were clipped to reduce drag and increase roll rate. Cooling systems were enhanced to handle increased heat loads. The most extensively modified racing Mustangs bore limited resemblance to their wartime ancestors, but the fundamental airframe remained recognizable. The preservation movement that would eventually establish the Mustang as an iconic warbird began slowly and accelerated through the 1970s and 80s. Organizations like the Confederate Air Force, later renamed the Commemorative Air Force, acquired and restored Mustangs to flying condition. The restoration work required specialized knowledge. Many systems on the P-51D, from the hydraulic landing gear to the oxygen system, demanded expertise that was disappearing as wartime mechanics retired. Documentation existed, but practical experience was irreplaceable. The early restorers created knowledge bases and training programs that would support Mustang operations for decades. The economics of Mustang ownership changed dramatically as supply decreased and demand increased. In the 1950s, Mustangs were inexpensive surplus aircraft. By the 1970s, they were collectible warbirds. By the 1990s, prices had escalated to hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the 21st century, restored P-51Ds regularly sell for prices exceeding $2 million. Even partially restored or unrestored aircraft command substantial prices based on component value alone. The propeller from a P-51D can sell for $50,000. Original Packard Merlin engines, if rebuildable, are worth more than entire aircraft were in 1946. The Mustang's cultural impact extended beyond aviation enthusiasts. The aircraft appeared in films, television shows, and popular culture representations of World War II. The distinctive profile, the sound of the Merlin engine at full power, the polished aluminum finish or colorful nose art, all became visual shorthand for American air power in the European theater. The Tuskegee Airmen, the African-American pilots who flew P-51Cs and Ds with the 332nd Fighter Group, became synonymous with the red-tailed Mustangs they flew on bomber escort missions. Their combat record, their professionalism, and their role in demonstrating the capabilities of black pilots in an era of institutional racism made them legendary. The aircraft they flew became symbols of that legacy. The technical lessons from the Merlin Mustang conversion influenced post-war fighter design philosophy. The principle that airframe and power plant could be optimized separately, then integrated, became standard practice. The North American F-86 Sabre, designed in the late 1940s, used a modular approach where the fuselage, wings, and engine could be modified independently. Later fighters, like the McDonnell Douglas IV Phantom, were designed from inception to accommodate different engine options. The flexibility to upgrade power plants without redesigning the entire aircraft traced directly back to lessons learned when North Americans successfully installed the Merlin in an airframe designed for a completely different engine. The strategic doctrine implications proved equally influential. The Mustang's success validated long-range fighter escort as a viable concept. Post-war strategic planning assumed that bomber formations would operate with fighter protection throughout their missions. The development of aerial refueling expanded this principle. Fighters could now escort bombers across intercontinental distances. The concept of air superiority evolved from localized air-to-air combat to comprehensive control of airspace along entire mission profiles. These doctrines, refined during the Cold War, trace their conceptual origins to the missions Mustangs flew over Germany in 1944 and 1945. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.